Thank you all for joining us. I think you'll find that this now almost 60-year-old letter is extremely relevant to what we're going through today. So I hope you'll agree with that. Let me give you some background to Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham Jail. Obviously, it was written from the Birmingham Jail. Birmingham is an old manufacturing town. It was founded in 1871 at the crossroads of two railroads. And they started a town there because it was adjacent to some of the richest mineral deposits in the world: iron, coal, and limestone, which are the three ingredients for making steel. So the good executives from Pittsburgh laid claim to the Birmingham area. They say that Birmingham was really nothing more than a company town for U.S. Steel for most of its existence. And so it was really quite an extraordinary phenomenon in mining and manufacturing at the end of the 19th and through much of the 20th centuries. They called it the magic city of the world, the marvel of the South, the miracle of the continent, the dream of the hemisphere, the vision of all humankind. They were not bashful about trumpeting the virtues of their city. But it has also, over the years, gained not so pleasant nicknames. Some people refer to Birmingham as Bombingham or as Dynamite Hill. Black people's homes and churches have been bombed throughout much of the 20th century until, well, at least till 1963. And so Vulcan, the god of fire and metal, is the mascot for the city of Birmingham with his spear and hammer. This is interesting that a pagan symbol has become the mascot in this city of churches. Birmingham, through most of the 20th century, was not only the most segregated city in the United States, but also the blackest city. It's 39% black. So in November of 1962, George Wallace was elected governor of Alabama. And on January 14, 1963, he gave his inaugural speech not far from the site where Jefferson Davis took the oath of office as the President of the Confederacy. And his famous tagline from that speech was "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." One of the other important personages in this story of Martin Luther King's letter is Bull Connor, who was the Director of Public Safety in Birmingham in 1963. He is probably the white man most responsible for the progress of civil rights in the United States since 1963. More about that later. Had he not been monumentally clumsy and dense in his handling of the Children's March to City Hall in 1963, we would never be where we are today. So those photos of police dogs and fire hoses that changed America's mind about the civil rights struggle in Birmingham in 1963. One Black person asked, what if Bull Connor had just let us walk to City Hall and pray? It's a great question. He did not do that. And so that's why we have the history we have. Now, I've painted kind of a negative portrait of Birmingham so far, but I want to hasten to say that the city has turned its fortunes around. Mining and manufacturing disappeared from the city, so it was kind of in hard times through the mid part of the 20th century, and also it had a reputation for being utterly racist. But in fact, in 1979, just let that date sink into you. In 1979, 16 years after the events we're talking about, Birmingham elected its first Black mayor and elected him 4 more times after that. Richard Arrington Jr. was mayor of Birmingham from 1979 to 1999. So the 3 principals in the civil rights struggle in Birmingham in 1963 are 3 of the co-founders of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference: Fred Shuttlesworth, who at the time was a pastor in Cincinnati; Ralph Abernathy; pastor in Atlanta, and of course, Martin Luther King, another pastor in Atlanta. Martin Luther King, Fred Shuttlesworth, and Ralph Abernathy were all arrested on Good Friday. The symbolism is almost too good to be true. On Good Friday, April 12, 1963, the policemen, under Bull Hunter's directions, picked them up by the belts from behind and threw them like a sack of grain into the paddy wagon and shipped them off to jail, where they were separated. Meanwhile, on April 12, 1963, Good Friday, 8 clergymen are getting together at the Tutwiler Hotel in Birmingham, Alabama. Today, the Tutwiler is a Hampton Inn, but that's a little misleading. In 1963, the Tutwiler was the epitome of Southern hospitality. I wasn't there, but in my mind's eye, I see sterling silver and white tablecloths, delicate teacups for the matriarchs who will gather later in the afternoon for tea, and waiters in black tie, black waistcoats, and black skin. So this is not a formal group. These are some of the leading clergy from, as you can see, the leading denominations in the United States. Also synagogue, of course. There are 5 bishops, 2 parish pastors, 1 rabbi. There were 2 Episcopalians, 2 Methodists, 1 Baptist, 1 Presbyterian, 1 Roman Catholic, and 1 Jewish rabbi. They considered themselves to be moderate, liberal even, within the Jim Crow frame of paternalistic reference, of course, but they will find that the middle of the road is the best place to get run over. They disagreed with the integrationists, integration now. They disagreed with the segregationists, integration never, but they didn't really know what they wanted. And so after this lunch at the Tutwiler, they got together and hastily put together a rather thoughtless statement of 428 words. And it was in response to this letter that Martin Luther King wrote his somewhat more thoughtful missive from the inevitable future, which rambled on for 7,110 words. The clergy letter was printed in 2 of the leading papers of the day, and one of Martin Luther King's associate either spirited the newspaper to him in jail or told him about this article, and he was just enraged that they would be opposed to him, because these were the best representatives of the white church at the time. So the message of the 8 white clergymen who gathered at the Tutwiler on April 12, 1963 was, not you, you're an outsider, not now, it's too early, and not here. I'll boil down Martin Luther King's 7,110 words to 3. Martin Luther King said all, now, and here. So they get together for this lunch at the Tutwiler and put this letter together. Martin Luther King responds with his own much more thoughtful, much longer letter. So when we read the letter from Birmingham Jail, we are eavesdropping on a conversation that's not really meant for us, right? Martin Luther King addressed his letter to 8 real and fleshed persons whom he at least knew about. He probably never met them, but they were by reputation some of the leading spiritual leaders in Birmingham at the time. Now, King's real audience, obviously, is the rest of America and the world, but he addressed this article to these 8 clergymen. If I have time, I'll tell you what happened to them after King wrote his letter to them. So Martin Luther King says, all, now, and here. And he says, for years now, the American Negro has been hearing the same refrain with a piercing familiarity. It is wait. And this wait has almost always meant never. Justice too long delayed, he says in the letter, is justice denied. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over and people are no longer willing to be plunged into an abyss of injustice where they experience the bleakness of corroding despair. I hope, sirs, you clergy people, I hope you ministers, you can understand our legitimate and unavoidable impatience. I've reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizens counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate. The moderate is more devoted to order than to justice. His notion of peace is not the presence of righteousness, but the absence of tension. He paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom. So Martin Luther King is in an isolation cell by himself. He is depressed. This civil rights campaign in Birmingham is not going the way he wanted it to. It's making a much quieter impact than he planned. Many of his fellow African Americans in Birmingham are refusing to be jailed, and it's been quiet. It's been off everybody's radar screen. So he's depressed. He is in a room with a cot without a mattress, a sink, a toilet, and a mirror. And they're refusing to bail him out because everything depends on his imprisonment. And so he gets started scribbling this letter, but he's got no pen and paper. So he starts writing it on scraps of toilet paper and in the margins of newspaper that his friends and friendly guards are smuggling into him in his jail cell. The executive director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Wyatt T. Walker, is receiving these scraps of toilet paper and newspapers with scribbling in the margins at SCLC headquarters in Birmingham. And his secretary, listen, this is just too good to be true. His secretary is named Willie Pearl Mackey. Is that a name out of a novel? Is that a name out of Harper Lee or something? Willie Pearl Mackey sits down at an IBM Selectric typewriter and starts banging away. If you, when the letter is finally published, it's a letter, right? It's not a pamphlet. It's not an article. It's not a book. It's a letter. And so you sign the letter Martin Luther King, but your amanuensis signs his or her name as well in lower cap letters. So what that letter says at the bottom is MLK:WM for Willie Pearl Mackey. One night around midnight, Willie Pearl Mackey is banging out this missive from these scraps of toilet paper and this newspaper with scribbles in the margin, and she falls fast asleep with her forehead on the keyboard. And Wyatt Walker picks her up, takes her over to the couch, and starts banging away at the letter himself. So they have no idea what the right order of these things is. So these are scraps of toilet paper and newspaper, and they're trying to figure out, well, this is paragraph A and this is paragraph D, and we have to find paragraphs B and C to insert between. So it's like a jigsaw puzzle. They stay up all night working on this. And while Willie Pearl Mackey is transcribing Martin Luther King's longhand to this IBM Selectric, she's tossing the toilet paper and the newspaper in the wastebasket. Nobody knew the impact that this letter would have on America itself at the time. You've heard me say this before, that many, many Americans treat Letter from Birmingham Jail as the 67th book of the Bible. It is so lofty and so sacred that it belongs with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But Willie Pearl Mackey did not know that on April 12 through 16, 1963. So she's tossing all of these scraps of paper into the wastebasket. And for the rest of her life, she will just regret and lament the fact that she could not foresee how meaningful these scraps of paper. If she had retained the original autographs of Martin Luther King, we would have them protected behind bulletproof glass with the Constitution and the Declaration at the National Archives. So once again, the white clergy letter says, not you, not now, not here. Martin Luther King's letter responds, all, now, and here. But let's look at those some of those 8 clergy who wrote the original 428-word letter. One of them is the Roman Catholic Bishop Joseph Aloysius Durick. The Reverend Durick was the 7th of 12 children of immigrant parents. Early 20th century Birmingham was shocked by all the Roman Catholic immigrants coming into the city to work in the mines. The Ku Klux Klan was trying to tell its members that the Pope was spiriting Catholics into Mobile Bay via submarine to forcibly convert all of Alabama to Roman Catholicism. So what's interesting about this is that Bishop Durick was intimately acquainted with discrimination from the other end. Catholics were loathed in Birmingham early in the 20th century. And I guess one thing I want to impress upon you about this letter is that these 8 clergy persons were doing the best they could with what they had. Joseph Durick was probably the most committed of the 8 clergy who wrote this letter. Later, in 1968, when the Memphis sanitation workers went on strike, this is ultimately what would take Martin Luther King's life, of course. He was in Memphis for the strike. Bishop Durick sent them $1,000 and said, "This is for the poor among you." It was the first gift from a white denomination. When he was serving in Memphis, he was the chaplain at St. Joe's Hospital there, and the employees were trying to unionize the hospital. And he was one of the few people on the board who championed the unionization of the hospital. And he says, "They had me outnumbered, but I had them outdressed." He normally would wear a black suit and a clergy collar like this, but when he went to those board meetings to argue with the board at St. Joe's Hospital, this is how he would dress. When Martin Luther King was killed, Bishop Durick said a mass for him in Memphis. And now get this, Bishop Durick read passages from the letter from Birmingham Jail. How great a sign of humility is that? Late in his career, he relinquished his bishop's responsibility and became a full-time prison chaplain. He said he was doing time. He was repenting for his stance against the civil rights campaign in 1963. They had me outnumbered, but I had them outdressed. Rabbi Milton Grafman. I mean, can you imagine being Jewish in Birmingham in 1940, 1950, 1960? Rabbi Grafman, like Bishop Durick, also endured his own discrimination. He was excoriated on the right and on the left for his participation in the clergyman's letter. He received round-the-clock harassing phone calls. Rabbi Grafman kept a shrill police whistle next to the phone to blow out the ear of callers. In September, after the bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church, Rabbi Grafman raises money from his congregation to rebuild the church. So there are 5 bishops, a rabbi, and only 2 parish pastors. One of them was Earl Stallings. He was the pastor of the First Baptist Church in Birmingham. Very prestigious congregation. On Easter Sunday, April 14, 1963, when the letter is just coming out and Abernathy, Shuttlesworth, and King are still in jail, Andrew Young and 2 young black women, 2 college-age black women, enter First Baptist Church and sit down 4 rows from the back. 70 worshipers immediately exited in protest. After the service, the Reverend Stallings shakes hands with these strange visitors and asks them to return soon and often. And like Rabbi Grafman, the Reverend Stallings receives a constant flow of harassing phone calls 24 hours a day. But he takes every one of them because one of his parishioners might need him. Left in 1965, the neighborhood around First Baptist Church of Birmingham becomes increasingly black. The church eventually sells the building to a neighboring bank, removes all the beautiful stained glass windows in the church, and puts plywood in their place. And eventually, the church is paved over as a parking lot. This is the new First Baptist Church out in the suburbs. This is the original First Baptist Church. First Presbyterian Church of Birmingham is just as prestigious as First Baptist Church. Ed Ramage is the pastor there. These white pastors know ferment is coming, right? They know that Black Americans, Black Birminghamians are going to try to integrate their churches forcibly. And so the Reverend Ramage has his parish hold Sunday school classes for weeks on end to prepare for this integration. He takes his ushers aside and says, when these folks come to our church, you make sure they get a warm welcome, right? And so on Easter Sunday, April 14, 1963, many members at First Presbyterian Church can see what's coming, so they decide to stay home. Many of them go to have tea at a Jewish deli to contemplate the ironies of Southern Christianity. 2 Black women arrive for the service on Easter Sunday. There are no seats except, guess where? In the front row. So the ushers escort these 2 Black women down to the front row. Some parishioners, this is the pastor's wife who's telling the story. Some parishioners literally drop their hymn books. They're singing Jesus Christ is risen today. How's that for another little vignette out of a novel? Some of the parishioners drop their hymn books. The singing dies down to a sad whimper. And Catherine Ramage, Ed's wife, will report that as the young women entered, a wave of static electricity seemed to pass over the congregation and make everybody's hair stand on end. A handful of worshipers leave in protest. And after the service, the pastor greets these 2 young women and says, please come again. After the service, the aftermath, when church leaders meet to discuss the implications of integration, the Reverend Ramage says to his elders, you have to remember our Christian principles. And one of the elders thunders back, to hell with Christian principles, we've got to save our church. Reverend Ramage will receive death threats in the mail and by phone until he finally is driven out of town that summer. So what are the implications of this situation for us? I mean, I think one of the things I learned from this is that the buildings of congregations who say to hell with Christian principles, we've got to save our church, get bulldozed into parking lots. And we might also learn that the middle of the road is the best place to get run over. As Jesus puts it to the church at Laodicea in the book of Revelation, you are lukewarm, and I will spit you out of my mouth. And I hope we've learned that the Bible has a great deal to say about social justice and our political decisions. Martin Luther King, in his letter from Birmingham Jail and in every one of his sermons, is taking his text and his principles and his ideas straight from Christian scripture, which has everything to do not just with the world to come, but with this world as well. In both halves of our Bible, the Hebrew and the Christian halves of our Bible, the central story is one of a freedom fighter. So Moses is nothing more than a proto Che Guevara, right? Proto Martin Luther King. And Martin Luther King is a 20th century Moses. Likewise, in the New Testament, the Christian half of our Bible, we have to remember that Jesus was murdered by the empire, by the powers that be, because he was a rabble rouser and dangerous and threatened the empire. And so I am so happy that Martin Luther King is one of the shafts of light in our Malott Chapel. In 1993, Kenilworth Union Church decided that he was one of the people that we need to look up to and by whose light we need to shape our character and to build our virtue. So, letter from Birmingham Jail didn't get much exposure until June of that year. It was written, I think the date on the letter is actually April 16. He went into prison on April 12, but the date on the letter is April 16. Nobody knew about it until the Christian Century published the article in full, 7,000 words, in June of 1963. So even when Martin Luther King is released from jail on April 20, he's severely disappointed in the impact of the Civil Rights Campaign in 1963. But like a knight on a swift steed, Bull Connor comes to the rescue. They called May 2, 1963, so Martin Luther King's been out of jail for 12 days. They called May 2, 1963, D-Day, when Abernathy and Shuttlesworth and King decide to use African-American children to spearhead their campaign, to do their marching for them, to march to City Hall down the streets of Birmingham. And this is where everything changes. Not the letter. The letter hasn't even been seen by most of America yet, but by Bull Connor. And this is why. He unleashes his fire hoses. These fire hoses could rip bark off trees and bricks off buildings. When you were doused with one of these fire hoses, the clothes were shredded from your body. And probably the most famous photo from American civil rights history is this. This young man is a young man named Walter Gadsden. He has his arms down. He is not protesting, but Bull Connor's police dogs attack him nonetheless. And these two pictures, more than two pictures, but these are two of the kind of pictures that appeared on the first page of the New York Times and the Detroit Free Press, the Washington Post. Up until this time, the New York Times, for instance, which we think of as a very progressive newspaper, was not progressive in the middle of the 20th century, just excoriated Martin Luther King for his civil rights campaign. But when its photographers and reporters got hold of these photographs and this story, the New York Times did an about face, just almost a 180. And its editorial perspective changed and said to Governor Wallace and to Bull Connor, Director of Public Safety in Birmingham, you've got to stop this inhumanity. These are the photos that changed the civil rights movement. And then, of course, on September 15, 1963, Youth Sunday at 16th Street Baptist Church. The theme of Youth Sunday that year was The Love That Forgives. 4 young girls all dressed in white were preparing to lead the service when a bomb went off. Cynthia Wesley's parents identified her remains by the shoes on her feet and the ring on her finger. The church clock had stopped at 10:22 a.m., 38 minutes before the service was to begin. The face of Jesus was blasted out of the only stained glass window to survive the force of the blast. Later on a television show, James Baldwin would talk to Reinhold Niebuhr about the missing face of Christ. So I don't know, maybe I'm too spiritual or too romantic for my own good, but the way these pieces fell into place in Birmingham from late March to the fall of 1963 just feels destined, fated, providential. These are the things that changed America's mind.